What if I told you that the origin story of the entire animal kingdom, literally the story of exactly where and how we all come from, just got completely rewritten, right? For decades, we kind of thought we knew exactly where the first complex moving animals evolved. But, well, a massive new discovery just took that assumption and flipped it completely upside down. So let's dive right into this explainer. We're looking at a huge piece of breaking news. It's a newly published research paper titled Discovery of White Sea Assemblage Fossils from Laurentia. It was led by Scott D. Evans, Eric A. Sperling, Kimberly V. Law, and Justin V. Strauss, and it just dropped in the journal Science Advances. I really want to treat this like the major news story it is, because this paper solves a huge mystery about where our absolute earliest animal ancestors first started moving around. And honestly, it has some pretty incredible implications for how we understand evolutionary history as a whole. Okay, to understand why this paper is such a game changer right now, we first need to talk about where this geological crime scene is actually located. The researchers found these fossils in a place called Laurentia. Now, if you're not a geology buff, Laurentia is basically just the geological name for ancient North America. And finding these specific fossils here, it's a huge deal. As you'll see in a minute, it completely changes our understanding of the exact geographical and environmental starting line for complex life on Earth. Let's set up the cold case these researchers were trying to crack. Where did the very first animals actually come from? The problem they were tackling is this super long-standing assumption in paleontology. For the longest time, we just assumed that the earliest complex animals originated in warm, shallow, sunlit coastal waters. And, it makes intuitive sense. Sunlight, warmth, lots of energy, it feels like the absolute perfect nursery for complex life, right? That was the firmly established narrative. But before we reveal the big twist, let's quickly break down the main subjects of our investigation here, the White Sea assemblage. Basically, this is a specific, very famous wave of early, super bizarre, soft-bodied sea creatures. They lived during what's called the Ediacaran period. So we are talking about the very dawn of animal life, way before the famous Cambrian explosion. And these things were weird, truly alien-looking. Some were shaped like ribbed ovals, others looked like segmented ribbons or even fronds, but they represent this unprecedented leap in evolutionary complexity. So how did the team actually approach this mystery? Well, they didn't just dig through old museum drawers. They launched a seriously ambitious geological expedition. They specifically targeted the remote, incredibly rugged Mackenzie Mountains up in the Northwest Territories of Canada. They were literally hiking deep into this brutal terrain, physically hunting for ancient rock formations that might just hold new clues to this exact window in evolutionary time. And once they got out there, they zeroed in on a specific layer of rock known as the Lower Blue Flower Formation. But here is the absolute crucial point. These rocks, they are deep water slope deposits. We are talking about an environment far, far below where storm waves could ever reach, completely cut off from any sunlight. It was the dark, freezing, deep ocean abyss. Which brings us to the ultimate plot twist. Because right there, in these deep, dark ocean rocks, they found the smoking gun. They discovered these specific white sea fossils pinned, almost like Polaroids on a corkboard, right inside these deep water rock deposits. And this is an absolutely massive surprise because, remember, these incredibly complex creatures were strictly supposed to be shallow water dwellers. No way should they be down here. Let's look a bit closer at what they actually found. They uncovered fossils of creatures like Dickinsonia and Kimberella. Now, why are those two names so important? It's because they are widely considered to be some of the oldest motile animals, which is just a fancy way of saying they were creatures that could actually move around on their own. Finding them in this rock proves definitively that complex mobile life wasn't just barely surviving in the deep, dark ocean abyss, it was actively thriving and grazing down there. So what does this all mean? Well, all this data builds a completely new timeline. We are aggressively rewriting the history books right here. See, previously, older, simpler organisms called the Avalon fauna were known to be in deep water. But the complex white sea creatures, we thought they showed up much later, around 559 million years ago, and strictly in the shallows. This discovery literally crosses that old assumption right out. The new data heavily circles a much older date, 567 million years ago, and it places them squarely in the deep water. They just pushed the clock back almost 10 million years for these animals. Now, you might be wondering, how confident should we actually be in this result? Well, the verdict is incredibly strong. The researchers used radiometric dating, which is absolutely the gold standard for finding the true age of rocks. and it confirmed that 567 million year timeline. On top of that, they found untouched bedding planes. That means these fossils weren't just, washed down a slope from the shallows. These animals lived, breathed, and died right there in the deep. But as with any ancient cold case, we do have to acknowledge the caveats. The fossil record is just inherently messy, and there's always an incomplete sampling bias. We can only really study what happened to be preserved. And that brings us to the limitations and the open questions that still remain. Take a close look at this negative mold impression of a Dickinsonia. Because these were entirely soft-bodied creatures, no bones, no hard shells, getting pristine, three-dimensional preservation is incredibly rare. So while we have these amazing outlines and impressions in the rock, it leaves open a really huge question. What other fragile, bizarre creatures were crawling around down there that simply didn't survive the fossilization process? We are for sure only seeing a partial lineup of suspects here. Okay, so what is the single most important insight you should take away from all this research? Simply put, it's a complete inversion of the old view. The old textbook view said complex life started in the shallow, sunlit waters. But this new view, established by this exact research, is that these early, mobile animals originated in the deep. But why? Well, the researchers actually hypothesized that early animals sought out the temperature stability of the deep, dark ocean. The shallow waters were just too volatile, way too prone to extreme temperature swings. So these creatures needed this stable, quiet abyss to establish themselves long before they eventually migrated up to the shallows millions of years later. Which leaves us with a truly mind-bending thought about how we view our own history. Next time you look at the ocean, or honestly, even just look at your own hands, remember this. The latest science now points to the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean as the ultimate cradle of complex animal mobility. Did your deepest, most ancient ancestors first learn to crawl, not in a warm, sunlit tide pool, but out of the freezing, pitch-black abyss? It completely changes how we view our own evolutionary tree, doesn't it?